They said no man in his right mind would take in a woman like her, too old, too poor, and already burdened with 7 hungry daughters. The townsfolk stood in the blowing dust, arms crossed, watching as she was forced from the only home she'd ever known. Her shoes were full of gravel, her daughters silent, clutching the last of their bread. Most looked away. One man did not. The rancher had grief in his eyes and calluses on his hands. He stepped forward, studied her for a long moment, then simply said, "You're coming with me." He didn't know her story, and she didn't know his, but that one sentence would unravel decades of secrets, heartbreak, and quiet resilience. They whispered that she'd made her bed and had to lie in it. The truth was darker, hidden behind closed doors, whispered threats, and years of surviving what would have broken most. She had been abandoned, betrayed, and left with nothing but her dignity and the children who still looked to her for everything. Accepting his offer meant risking her pride. Refusing meant risking their lives. She almost said no, until the first raindrops slid down her youngest child's face. What she didn't know was that saying yes would lead them both into a story of hardship and redemption, where reputations would be tested, hearts would be mended, and the one thing they thought was lost forever would quietly take root again. They called her a curse. Too many daughters, no sons, no value. On that dry autumn afternoon, Clara stood in the yard while the man she once called husband loaded her life onto a wagon and told her she had until sundown to be gone. 7 girls, ranging from a toddler clutching her hem to the eldest already carrying burdens too heavy for her age, stood in a crooked line, silent as fence posts. There was no shouting, no dramatic farewell, just the sound of chickens scratching in the dust and the cold creak of the wagon's wheels as they rolled away from the house she had kept for 22 years. Clara didn't cry. She had long ago learned that tears did little in the West except make dust cling to your cheeks. Inside, she folded the pain the way she folded laundry, small, tight, tucked away where it wouldn't spill. The road out of town stretched like a rope into the horizon, dry grass swaying on either side. She walked with her daughters until the sky turned orange, each step heavier than the last. People looked, some with pity, most with relief that it wasn't them. She had no plan, no place to go. Only the will to keep her girls safe, even if it meant sleeping under the stars that night. But life in the West has a way of shifting in the space of a heartbeat, and before that sun touched the horizon, a voice from behind would change everything. The sound came first, hoofbeats slow but steady, carrying the weight of someone who wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere, but wasn't lost either. Clara turned her daughters instinctively, gathering closer around her like quail when a hawk passes overhead. A tall man on a chestnut gelding appeared from the ridge. His hat was low, shadowing eyes that seemed to measure more than they revealed. He didn't ride like a ranch hand or a drifter. His back was straight, movements deliberate. He looked like a man who had known loss and learned to live with it the way you learn to live with an old scar. When his gaze landed on the 7 girls, something flickered in him, something that made him sit a little taller in the saddle. He dismounted without a word, his boots pressing deep into the dry earth. "You've a long walk ahead of you," he said finally, voice low and even. Clara studied him wary. In the West, kindness from strangers often came with a price. "We'll manage," she replied, though her feet throbbed and her daughters' faces were flushed with heat. He glanced at the setting sun, then at the smallest girl tugging at Clara's skirt. "No," he said almost to himself. "You won't." Then without asking, he nodded toward his wagon, a sturdy rig hitched to a pair of patient mules. "You're coming with me." The girls looked at their mother, eyes wide. Clara felt the words settle on her like an unexpected blanket, warm, heavy, impossible to ignore. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his intentions. But something in his tone told her this wasn't pity. It was a choice. The wagon creaked as Clara helped her daughters climb up one by one. Their small hands clung to the edges, their faces a mix of relief and suspicion. The man, still nameless to her, stood by, steadying the mules, his expression unreadable. When she hesitated at the last step, his eyes met hers. "You coming?" It wasn't impatient. It wasn't commanding. It was certain. Clara climbed aboard, settling at the far edge of the bench. The girls clustered behind her. She kept her gaze on the road ahead, refusing to let the comfort of sitting ease the tension in her chest. She'd learned long ago that ease could be dangerous. It made you forget how quickly the ground could vanish beneath your feet. The mules started forward, their slow rhythm giving the moment a strange kind of peace. Dust swirled in the golden light, settling over the wagon like an old quilt. The man kept his hands steady on the reins, saying nothing. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. "You don't even know our names." His jaw flexed slightly, but he didn't look at her. "Don't need to. You're people who need a place. I've got one." She didn't answer right away. Her instinct was to push back, to question what that place might cost. But her youngest Mary was already leaning against her, half-asleep, safe in the sway of the wagon. That image softened something in Clara's guard. "You don't seem the type to pick up strays," she said. "Not in the habit," he replied. "But I had a wife once. She'd have done the same. Can't ride past and pretend I didn't see you." His voice shifted at the mention of his wife, not with sorrow alone, but with a kind of reverence, like speaking her name in church. Clara felt a pinch in her chest. She knew what it was to love and lose. They rode in silence again, the road narrowing between low, dusty hills. The land felt both endless and intimate, like it could swallow you whole, but also hold you gently if it wanted. When they crested a rise, his homestead came into view, a modest ranch tucked against a line of cottonwoods, the roofs weathered but standing smoke curling from the chimney. To Clara's eyes, it looked like a story she'd once told herself, but had long stopped believing. The girls whispered their excitement, bubbling up despite their exhaustion. But Clara's mind still churned. "What do you want from us?" she asked, the words sharper than she meant. He pulled the mules to a slow halt just before the front gate. The creak of leather and wood filled the air. Then he turned to her, his gaze direct. "Nothing you can't give. I've got work needs doing, a kitchen that's too quiet and ground that's too still. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm looking for life." The honesty in it knocked the breath from her. She had met too many men whose kindness was just a net for their own hunger. But this sounded like a man willing to share his table without counting the spoons. Still, fear lingered. "And if I say no, then I'll drive you to the next town. But you should know." He paused, glancing at her daughters. "Winter's coming fast, and folks out there don't always care to make room for 7 girls and their mama." The truth of it hit hard. She thought of the faces they'd seen that morning, turned away, lips tight, eyes colder than the wind. She took a long breath, her fingers brushing the frayed hem of her skirt. She wasn't ready to trust, but she was too tired to keep running. Clara nodded once. "We'll stay. For now." Something like relief passed over his face, though he hid it quickly. He flicked the reins, guiding the wagon through the gate. The ranch seemed to open around them, the evening light catching on the wheatgrass and weathered boards. When they reached the porch, he stepped down and offered his hand. Clara hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, warm, and careful, like he knew her bones had carried more than her fair share of weight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something baking. The kitchen table was wide and worn smooth, as if it had been waiting for more chairs to fill it. "You can take the big bedroom," he said, nodding toward the back of the house. "Girls can share the loft. I'll sleep out in the bunkhouse." It was such a simple arrangement, offered without condition, that Clara felt the sting of tears. She turned away quickly, hiding her face from the girls. They set their meager belongings down, the sound of boots on wood, marking the beginning of something new, though whether it was salvation or just another stop along a hard road, Clara couldn't yet say. That night, long after the girls had fallen asleep, she stood by the small window in the bedroom. Outside, the moon laid silver across the yard. The man, still unnamed in her mind, walked from the barn toward the bunkhouse, his figure steady, unhurried. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel entirely invisible. And that in itself was dangerous, because she knew what hope could do to a person. The first days on the ranch were quiet, too quiet. Clara rose early, long before the sun crested the cottonwoods. It was habit born from years of having to work before the world noticed she was there. She lit the stove, coaxing life into the firebox, the warmth creeping into her fingers. The girls took to their new surroundings with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Relief that they had a roof and steady meals. Suspicion that it might all disappear without warning. Clara recognized that in them. It was the same way she had learned to walk through life. The man, his name she learned was Elias, kept his distance. He worked the land, tended the animals, and came in for meals without fuss. At first she thought it was disinterest, but she soon realized it was something else, respect perhaps. A kind of deliberate giving of space, as though he knew her ribs had been built into armor and didn't intend to pry them open too fast. Still, the quiet stretch taught some days. She would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, while she kneaded bread or patched one of the girls' dresses. Not with the hungry gaze she was used to from men, but with something gentler, curious, measured. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. One afternoon she found him in the barn repairing a broken latch. She'd meant only to fetch eggs, but something in the way the light slanted across the dust made her pause. "You run this place alone?" she asked. "Since my wife passed," he replied matter of fact. "It's been quiet." Clara hesitated. "And now you've filled it with strangers." Elias didn't stop working. Not strangers, just folks who needed a door open. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but the past had taught her that open doors came with locks you didn't see until you were inside. That evening, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The girls huddled near the fire, mending small toys with scraps of fabric. Clara stirred a pot of stew, the smell filling the room. Elias came in, stamping the cold from his boots, and set a small bundle on the table. "For you," he said simply. Inside was a length of soft flannel in a faded rose print. "Found it in town. Thought it might make the girls' new dresses?" Clara froze. The gesture was harmless enough, kind even, but it scraped at the edges of her caution. In her life, gifts were rarely given without expectation. Why, she asked. Elias seemed almost puzzled by the question. "Because winter's coming, and I figured you'd know how to put it to good use." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, tucking the fabric back in its wrapping. "Thank you." Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Clara sat by the window with a lamp burning low. The fabric lay across her lap, and she ran her fingers over it, remembering the last time a man had given her something, a pair of shoes, in exchange for work that had cost her far more than labor. The memory soured her stomach. She folded the flannel carefully and set it aside. Days turned into weeks. The girls laughed more now, their voices echoing in the once quiet house. Elias fixed a squeaky hinge on the bedroom door, added hooks in the kitchen for Clara's pots. Life took on a rhythm that should have felt safe. And yet, Clara couldn't shake the unease. Every kindness from Elias was like a pebble dropped into still water. It rippled through her, stirring memories she'd buried deep. One morning she overheard two ranch hands in town talking about her. "Can't believe he took her in. 7 kids and she ain't young herself. Maybe he's desperate, or maybe he's just soft in the head." Their laughter followed her down the street. She kept her head high, but inside the words hit their mark. That night, while clearing the table, she finally asked the question she'd been holding back. "Why us, Elias, really?" He set down his mug, met her eyes without flinching. "Because I know what it's like to be left standing in the cold with nowhere to go. And I made a promise to myself and to my wife before she died that if I could spare someone that I would." His answer should have eased her, but instead it deepened the ache in her chest. She didn't know if she could accept kindness without trying to repay it, and she didn't have much left to give. That night, lying awake with the wind sighing through the eaves, Clara realized the truth of her fear. It wasn't that Elias might hurt her. It was that he might not, and she didn't know how to live in a world where kindness didn't come with chains. It began with the wind. Not the gentle sigh that slipped through the eaves at night, but a roar that rattled the shutters and sent the barn doors clapping against their hinges. By late afternoon, the sky had turned to bruised gray clouds boiling low. The girls were restless, pacing the house like kittens, sensing a storm. Elias worked to secure the corrals, his figure a dark outline against the swirling dust. Clara kept the girls busy gathering kindling, latching windows, but her own nerves were taut. She'd weathered storms before, and she knew the signs. This one would be bad. When the first jagged flash of lightning split the horizon, she felt it in her bones. The wind tore at the outbuildings, flinging grit into the air. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked like a gunshot. Then came the sound she dreaded, the frantic bawl of livestock. Elias burst through the door, face flushed from the wind. "The south fence is down. If the cattle get loose, we'll lose half the herd." She saw the calculation in his eyes. He couldn't both keep the animals in and ensure the girls were safe. "I'll stay," she said quickly. "Get the fence." "You sure?" Clara nodded. "Go." The moment he was gone, the wind seemed to double in strength, pressing against the walls. She lit extra lamps, keeping the girls in the main room, telling stories to distract them from each howl outside. but her own heart pounded with each creak of the timbers. Then she heard it, a thin, desperate cry carried by the wind. Not from inside, from outside. Clara froze. Another cry came weaker this time. She realized with a jolt that one of the youngest girls, May barely 5, was missing. She didn't stop to think. Grabbing her shawl, she pushed into the storm. The wind knifed through the fabric, the rain stung her face. She followed the cries, stumbling toward the small shed near the edge of the property. There, huddled in the lee of the building, was May, her hair plastered to her head, eyes wide with terror. Clara scooped her up, wrapping her tight in the shawl. "I've got you, baby! I've got you!" The return was slow and punishing, each step a battle against the gale. By the time she staggered back into the house, her arms ached and her breath came in ragged gasps. But May was safe. Minutes later, Elias returned, soaked to the bone, but triumphant. Fences secure. No cattle lost. Then his eyes fell on Clara. Hair-damp shawl clinging to her shoulders. May curled in her lap. "What happened?" She told him, voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her chair. His hand hovered as if he wanted to touch her, but wasn't sure he had the right. "You went out in that for her?" "She's one of mine," Clara said simply. "That's what you do." Something in his expression shifted like a door opening. For the rest of the night, they sat by the fire, the storm still rattling the roof, but less fearsome now that they were all inside together. When the wind finally died toward dawn, the ranch was still standing. So were they. In the pale morning light, Elias poured her a cup of coffee and set it gently before her. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you've been carrying weight a long time. You don't have to do it alone here." She looked into his eyes, searching for the hook, the hidden bargain that always seemed to come with such promises. But there was none, just a steady warmth that unnerved her more than any storm. For the first time since stepping onto this land, Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe she could breathe here. It had been nearly 3 months since the storm. Life had settled into a rhythm, slow, steady, and almost too quiet for a woman who'd spent years bracing for the next blow. Clara found herself humming in the kitchen, sometimes catching her own voice like it belonged to a stranger. The girls were thriving. May clung to her, less now, running through the yard with her sisters until the sun slipped low. Evenings were the best, Elias reading by the fire, the girls mending doll clothes, Clara knitting with a contentment that was new and foreign. One late afternoon, Clara was sweeping the front porch when she saw the rider. Dust plumed behind him, the sinking sun turning the air to copper. He was too well dressed for a ranch hand, his horse too fine for a man just passing through. Something in her gut tightened. The man dismounted, tipped his hat politely, and held out an envelope. For Mrs. Clara Bennett. She stared at the name. Bennett was the name she had taken here, Elias's name. But the script on the envelope. She knew it. Her hands trembled as she took it. The man didn't linger, just remounted and rode away, leaving nothing but the fading thud of hooves. Inside, alone in the kitchen, Clara broke the seal. "Clara, you can't hide forever. I know where you are. We need to talk. You owe me more than you think." No signature. But she didn't need one. The words dragged her back like a riptide, back to the man who had once held a claim on her life, who had used her as collateral in debts she never agreed to. Back to the nights when she'd lain awake wondering if survival was worth the cost. She folded the letter quickly, shoving it deep into her apron pocket. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself he couldn't touch her here. But that night she hardly slept. The next morning she found Elias mending a gate. She wanted to tell him, wanted to let someone else carry even a corner of this weight, but the words caught in her throat. Men she'd trusted before had turned her truth into a weapon. Instead, she worked harder, cooked more, laughed louder, as if she could drown the letter's threat with the sound of normal life. But the tension seeped through. Elias noticed her distraction. "Something's on your mind," he said one evening when the girls were in bed. Clara hesitated. The kitchen lamp flickered in the draught, throwing shadows on the walls. Her hand went to her apron pocket out of habit, feeling the crinkle of the folded paper. She almost said nothing, but then she remembered the night of the storm, the way he'd looked at her by the fire, not as a burden or a bargain, but as someone worth standing beside. So she told him, all of it. The marriage forced on her to settle another man's debt, the years of labor without kindness, The day she'd walked away knowing he'd never forgive her for surviving without him. And now this letter. When she finished, she braced herself for the shift. For suspicion, for pity, for some change in his eyes that would make the walls between them higher than before. But Elias didn't move away. He reached across the table, resting his rough, warm hand over hers. "You're not going back," he said simply. "And you're not facing him alone." The firmness in his voice made something crack open inside her. Not from fear this time, but from relief so deep it was almost pain. In that moment, she knew whatever storm this letter might bring, she wouldn't be weathering it as she had before. She was no longer a woman running. She was a woman with a place to stand. The morning after the letter, Elias rose before the girls. He sharpened 2 fence post chisels with the same devotion he gave to coffee, slow, sure, no wasted motion. When Clara stepped onto the porch shawl around her shoulders, he didn't make a speech. He set a small bell on the railing instead. "If trouble comes," he said, tapping the brass. "You ring. Folks hear the school bell. They come." Clara turned the bell in her hands, feeling its quiet promise. "I'm tired of running," she said. "Then we won't," he answered. They didn't have to wait long. By noon, 3 riders lifted a tail of dust across the flats. The lead man wore a slick smile and a town coat too fine for the county. Harlan Pike, a name that used to live under Clara's skin like a splinter. He swung down, clapped his gloves clean, and walked toward the porch as if he owned the road that carried him. "Clara," he said as though the years had been polite, "you owe me a conversation." Clara didn't step back. The girls arranged themselves without being told. Lila and Rose on either side of their mother, June. Maggie, Pearl, Dot, and May like a braid down the porch steps. 7 bright threads pulled tight. "What you're owed," Clara said, voice steady as an honesty you never once gave me. "You paid for a servant and called it a marriage. I paid with years I don't get back." Pike's grin twitched. He lifted a paper as if it were a badge. "I've got accounts, promises, witnesses who'll say as I say." Elias stepped into the doorway. He didn't crowd Clara, just stood where a door becomes a wall. "Not here, you don't." Pike weighed him, eyes flat as coins. "You're the rancher who collects strays." "I'm the man who keeps his word," Elias said. "And she's the woman who doesn't belong to anyone." Pike's 2 riders shifted in their saddles. One spat. "We could take it to town," he muttered. "We already did," a new voice called. Sheriff Abel Hart emerged from the lane, dusting his sleeves, hat low. Beside him rode Pastor Finch and Mrs. Beale, the school marm, who'd taken to reading with Lila some afternoons. They hadn't been summoned by gunfire. They'd come because the bell rang once light as a bird tapping glass, and word moved faster than thunder when a woman's past arrived uninvited. "Paper don't mean consent," the sheriff said, easy as a Sunday. He tucked his thumb in his vest. "And a threat ain't a claim." Pike's smile dropped its pretense. "She left my house. She left a cage," Mrs. Beale said, quiet and cutting. "If you brought a key, you'll find it doesn't fit living doors." The wind lifted the cottonwoods along the creek, so they answered with their old leafy hush. Clara felt the fear still living in her bones, years of it, and she did something wild for a woman whose life had been measured by others' voices. She stepped down one stair and spoke past Pike's shoulder, out into the open air, so whoever the day belonged to could hear. "My name is Clara Hale." "No longer," she said. "My name is Clara, just Clara, until I choose otherwise. I'm not a debt of bargain or a proof of anything but breath." Silence fell like good snow soft, covering the rough. The youngest May slid her hand into Clara's skirt and squeezed. Elias didn't touch Clara, but his presence cupped her words like warm palms. Pike tried swagger once more. "You'll come now," he said, losing the sugar on his tongue. "Or I'll." The bell sounded only once, but it was enough. From the lane, from the pasture, from the ribbon of road that wound from the schoolhouse, neighbors drifted and then gathered. Mrs. Albright from the wash, Nate the Smith, the Ortiz boys from the lower field, even old Mr. Talley, who hadn't been off his porch in a season. They formed nothing like a mob and everything like a living fence. Sheriff Hart adjusted his brim. "We're done, Mr. Pike. This county won't enforce your ego." Pike saw it then, the arithmetic even a bully could learn. No stage, no audience. No woman to crush quietly, just a porch filled with girls who didn't flinch, and a man who didn't reach for his gun because he didn't need it. He sniffed toward the paper, let the scraps fall, and turned like someone remembering an appointment with his own smallness. Halfway to his horse, he glanced back and spat his last splinter. "You'll regret this." Clara surprised herself with a nod. "Maybe," she said, "but not today." They watched the dust receive him. The sheriff tipped his hat to Clara. "You ring again if that bell needs a louder cousin," he said, patting the badge on his vest. The neighbors eased away their presence, leaving a shape behind it, like hands cupped around a flame that had decided to live. When the yard was quiet, Elias leaned his shoulder to the porch post and exhaled the way men do when their lungs remember depth. Clara sat on the step, the girls pooling around her like sunlight. "I thought my voice would break," she said. "It didn't," Elias replied. "It grew." Leela's sharp-eyed, steady look between them. "Are we staying?" Elias knelt so he was eye to eye with all seven. "As long as your mama says," he said, using the name the girls had dared to try on weeks ago in whispers, as if love might startle. "And if she says yes, we plant a tree that outlives all of us." Clara's laugh came out like a sob caught on joy. "A cottonwood," she said. "Those hold river songs." They planted at dusk, spade by spade, Elias cutting the square, Lila tamping June, fetching water, May patting the wet earth like a blessing. Clara pressed her palm against the young trunk. Under her hand a thrum she almost believed in sap beginning, or her own pulse agreeing. When the stars pricked the dark pastor, Finch cleared his throat. "Seems a fine evening for vows," he said almost to himself. Clara turned. Vows had once been shackles. But the porch, the cottonwood, the 7 faces, she would cross a desert for none of it, felt like a trap. "I won't marry out of gratitude," she said, looking at Elias, daring him to meet the truth. "Or fear, or to make the town quiet." "Then don't," he answered, not moving closer, not making it easier. "Marry if you want mornings like this, bread cooling on the sill fence wire, singing girls arguing over the blue ribbon, or don't. I'll be here either way." The choice walked right up to Clara and waited, unafraid of her history. She'd been chosen, claimed, traded, left. This time no one reached for her arm. She stepped into the space between them because it was hers. "Pastor," she said, "you can keep it small." He smiled. "This county doesn't know how to do small, missus." Clara glanced at the girls at the cottonwood stitched into sky. Then she turned back to Elias, who was not reaching. Not pleading, only present, like good weather and work that mattered. "Bennett," she said softly, trying it on as if it were a coat sewn to her measurements. Clara Bennett. The vows were plain. Elias promised to stand beside what's true and mend what can be mended. Clara promised to keep a house where no one shrinks. Leela held the lantern, the flame steady as a heartbeat. Pastor Finch spoke the words that set down what was already standing, and the girls cheered, not because the West loves weddings, but because this one was theirs. They ate cornbread on the porch steps, butter melting into yellow rivers. Mrs. Beale brought a jar of blackberry preserves with a note tucked beneath the string. "For the Bennetts School tuition, payable in laughter and help with dishes." Sheriff Hart left a new rope swing coiled by the cottonwood. Nate the Smith returned at moonrise with a bent horseshoe hammered straight and polished bright. When the girls were finally tumbled into quilts and the neighbors' lanterns winked out one by one along the lane, Clara and Elias stood under the new tree. The sapling leaned a little toward her, or maybe she leaned a little toward it. "I kept thinking regret would arrive," she said, "like an old relative who never learned to knock." "If it does," Elias said, "we'll let it sit a spell, feed it something warm, and send it on its way." She laughed low, tired, full. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he replied, "but it's ours." He didn't kiss her like a prize. He pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, the way people lean toward a fire when the night remembers it's February. They stood that way until the cottonwood learned the sound of their quiet. In the mornings that followed, the bell didn't ring for danger. It rang for lessons. Bennetts School began beneath the eaves letters, chalked on a board. Elias planned himself. Lila taught Pearl her sums. Rose read aloud to May. June discovered she loved the feel of words under her tongue. Between chores, Clara stitched names into the hems of the girls' Sunday dresses, not to mark ownership, but to remind each of them she belonged to herself first and to this little nation next. Sometimes when the wind ran low through the cottonwood, Clara heard a rustle like pages turning. The past still existed, but the future made a longer sound. On the first real spring rain, she stood on the porch and let it cover her. It felt nothing like the storm she'd survived. It felt like a clean start arriving without apology. Home, she said to no one and everything. In the house, stubborn, good learning their names, the way it learned the light answered back without words. Some stories end at a wedding. This one begins at a school bell, and a small tree that will outlive all of them. Do you want an epilogue where each daughter finds her? Trail Lila, the lantern keeper, Rose the reader, June the horse whisperer. In the end, it wasn't the size of his ranch or the strength of his hands that changed her life. It was the quiet way he made space for her and her 7 daughters without asking what they could give in return. And it wasn't just her life that shifted. In time, the townsfolk began to see them differently. The woman they once called a burden became the heart of a home that welcomed anyone who needed a warm meal or a place to rest. Her daughters grew strong under a roof built not from wealth, but from kindness. Life in the West was still hard. Dust storms came, winters bit deep, but love and dignity have a way of weathering storms. What began with a single sentence, "You're coming with me," became a story of second chances and the healing that comes when someone believes in you without condition. Maybe that's something we can all carry into our own lives, offering kindness before judgment, and remembering that hope can take root in the unlikeliest soil. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to None Wild West Saga for more tales of love, courage, and redemption. Share it with someone who could use a reminder that it's never too late to start again. And tell me in the comments, would you like to hear what happened next for them? Or should I bring you more stories like this one?